3 weeks after my daughter's wedding. The bank called to tell me the $300,000 loan in my name had missed its first payment. That was the first moment I understood the loan was the real event. The wedding was just the cover. My name is Vivien Hartley. I was in my kitchen that morning in Savannah making tea when the phone rang. The woman on the line spoke calmly, the way people do when they are used to difficult conversations. She explained that a small business loan connected to my name had gone past its first payment date. I told her there had to be some mistake. My daughter Andrea had assured me that Edward's company had investors coming in. The loan was supposed to be temporary, something they needed while paperwork moved through. The woman paused, then clarified something I had not asked. The full amount of the loan was disbursed 48 hours after I signed the final guarantee, which happened to be the week before the wedding. By the time they walked down the aisle, the money was already sitting in an account I couldn't touch. After we ended the call, I stood there for a moment holding my phone. I remember the kettle starting to whistle, though I turned it off without pouring the water, out of habit. I opened Andrea's social media page. The newest photograph showed her and Edward on a beach somewhere bright and warm. The caption was simple: "New life. No regrets." I looked at the date. It matched the day the first payment was due. That was when a quiet realization settled in. Andrea and Edward had already moved on with their plans, and the part of the story I understood as a favor might have been something else entirely. I didn't know exactly how it had started yet, but I knew where I needed to begin looking. The phone call from the bank kept circling in my mind, and the more I thought about it, the clearer one memory became. Everything really started about 3 weeks before the wedding. The afternoon Andrea showed up at my townhouse with Edward. They arrived together and sat across from me at the kitchen table. Andrea looked excited, but also tense in a way I recognized from when she was younger and wanted something she thought I might refuse. Edward began explaining their situation before I could even ask. "We're finalizing investment funding," he told me, "but the bank suggested a short bridge loan so the company can keep moving while the paperwork closes." He spoke confidently, almost like he had rehearsed the explanation. Andrea leaned forward. "It's temporary, Mom, just until the investors come through." Then Edward added the number, $300,000. I remember repeating it quietly, just to hear how it sounded out loud. $300,000. Edward continued talking about new software contracts and expansion plans. The details sounded impressive, though I noticed he moved quickly through the financial parts. "The bank only needs one thing," he said finally. "A guarantor with strong credit." Andrea's eyes were already on me. Andrea explained that Edward's company needed to show liquidity to secure the venue and their future home. She admitted they had put the wedding expenses on high-interest credit cards, and this loan would consolidate that debt while keeping the business afloat. I felt the familiar pressure that comes with being a parent. After my husband died, Andrea and I had learned to rely on each other in ways most families never have to. I had spent years trying not to disappoint her. Still, I did not sign anything that day. Instead, I asked Edward direct questions about revenue projections and investors. He answered smoothly, without hesitation. That confidence should have reassured me, but somehow it didn't. Finally, I told them something that made the room go quiet. "My lawyer reads every financial document I sign." Andrea looked irritated for a moment. Edward just smiled. "Of course," he replied calmly. "That's completely reasonable." Andrea hugged me when they were leaving. "Mom, you're the only reason this wedding can still happen." After the door closed behind them, I sat at the table for a long time, thinking about the contract they had left with me. Something about it stayed in the back of my mind. Not a clear problem, just a feeling I could not explain yet. The next morning, I called my attorney and asked her to take a look at it. The next morning, I walked into Marcela Ruiz's office with the loan agreement in my bag. Marcella had handled several legal matters for me over the years, mostly small business contracts related to my design work. She was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words. I handed her the folder and explained the situation. My daughter and her fiancé need a bridge loan. I told her, $300,000. The bank wants me as guarantor. Marcella didn't react right away. She just opened the agreement and started reading. For a few minutes, the only sound in the room was the turning of paper. Finally, she looked up. The loan itself isn't unusual, she said calmly. But the structure matters. She pointed to a section near the beginning. Borrowers are Andrea Hartley and Edward Miller. Then she tapped another line. And the guarantor is you. I nodded. Marcella leaned back slightly. If they stop paying, the bank won't spend time chasing them first. They'll come directly to you. I had expected something like that, but hearing it stated so clearly made the risk feel heavier. She continued flipping through the pages. There's a simple protection we can add. What kind? I asked. Marcella slid the document toward me and pointed again. If the borrowers leave the United States or miss scheduled payments, the loan immediately enters full default enforcement. We can add an event of default clause. If the borrowers leave the United States for more than a set number of days or miss any scheduled payment, the loan accelerates immediately, and the bank is authorized to place a hold on the business accounts and pursue the borrower's collateral before enforcing the guarantee against you. It forces them to look at Edward's assets first. It won't stop the loan, I asked. No, she replied. But it prevents anyone from disappearing while you carry the entire burden. I sat there thinking about Andrea. Trusting her had always felt natural. Still, I remembered the years after my husband died, when I had to work through the debts he left behind. Those years had taught me something simple paperwork matters. Add the clause. I told her. The following afternoon, Andrea and Edward met me at the bank. They signed quickly. Edward flipped through the pages with barely a glance. The loan officer congratulated us as if this were just another routine step toward a happy wedding. At the time, that's exactly what I believed it was. The wedding took place along the Savannah riverfront on a warm evening in early spring. I had expected something elegant but simple. Andrea always liked nice things, but we had talked many times about keeping the celebration reasonable. When I arrived, I realized very quickly that reasonable had not been the plan. The reception hall was filled with imported flowers. Long tables held tall champagne glasses stacked into towers. A small string quartet played near the windows while guests moved through the room, greeting one another. It looked less like a family wedding and more like a magazine feature. I remember standing there quietly for a moment, trying to calculate the cost in my head. Even without knowing the exact numbers, it was clear the total must have been close to $200,000, far more than Andrea had described. Edward approached me during the reception with 2 glasses of champagne. Everything looks beautiful. Doesn't it? He remarked while handing me one. It certainly does, I replied. He nodded toward the room. Investors like confidence. Big launches matter. I looked at him for a second before answering. This is a wedding. He gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Later in the evening, Andrea stood up for a short toast. She looked happy, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen during the weeks of planning. She thanked her friends, thanked Edward, and then turned toward me. And to my amazing mom, she announced, lifting her glass. Thank you for the gift. People around the tables laughed softly and raised their glasses. I kept my glass raised, but my smile didn't reach my eyes. Calling a $300,000 obligation a gift told me exactly how she wanted to frame it, my risk, her celebration. I looked at Edward, and I knew right then that I wasn't his mother-in-law. I was his exit strategy. Across the room, Edward watched my reaction carefully. Our eyes met for just a moment. His expression was calm, almost analytical, like he was waiting to see how I would respond. The celebration continued late into the night. Eventually, Andrea and Edward left in a carriage waiting outside. I stood near the terrace railing watching them disappear down the street. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood the entire situation. Andrea had promised the loan would be paid back quickly. Still, the word gift remained in my thoughts long after the music ended. 2 weeks later, the silence was broken by a single Instagram post. Andrea and Edward were barefoot on a beach in Costa Rica, smiling under the caption, "New life, no regrets." I called her immediately. It went to voicemail. I tried Edward. Nothing. They weren't just traveling. They were disappearing. Then, a message from a wedding guest confirmed my worst fear. "I hope they enjoy the long honeymoon." That word honeymoon felt like a slap. There was no mention of a honeymoon during the loan negotiations. Edward was supposed to be back at his desk, closing the investor deal that would save my credit. Instead, he was sipping drinks on my dime. I opened the loan folder on my laptop. The first payment was due in 48 hours. While my daughter was busy starting her new life, she had forgotten that the old one was still tied to my signature. The realization was cold and final. Andrea hadn't just trusted a liar. She had helped him build the trap. I didn't send another message. I just waited for the bank to ring. The bank called again the next morning with more detail. I recognized the number from the earlier paperwork, so I answered right away. The woman on the line spoke in the same calm tone I remembered from the first conversation. "Ms. Hartley, I'm calling regarding the business loan you guaranteed. The first scheduled payment hasn't arrived." I kept my voice steady. "There must be some confusion. My daughter told me the investors would cover that." "I understand," she replied politely. "But the payment is currently overdue." I paused for a moment before asking the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind. Was the entire loan dispersed? "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes. The full amount was transferred to the borrower's business account 48 hours after you signed the final guarantee. 2 days. I thanked her for the information and ended the call. There was nothing else to discuss at that point. The kitchen was quiet after that. I sat at the table for a long time without moving, just thinking through the timeline in my head. Andrea's trip, Edward's company, the silence from both of them. Eventually, I opened my laptop and pulled up a folder I had created weeks earlier. The folder was labeled Contingency. Inside were the scanned copies of the loan agreement Marcella and I had reviewed together. The clause she added was still there in plain language, exactly where we placed it. I read through the document slowly, page by page. For most of my adult life, I had been the person who stepped in when something went wrong. Family problems, financial mistakes, situations that needed fixing. I had always handled them quietly. That habit was hard to break. Even now, part of me wanted to call Andrea and ask what had happened. Instead, I closed the laptop and sat there a little longer, letting the information settle. After the call from the bank, I contacted Marcella again. I asked if she could look into Edward's company a little more closely. She didn't ask many questions. She just told me she would check the public filings and business records. A couple of days later, we met in her office. Marcella placed a thin folder on the desk between us. "I found a few things you should see," she explained. She opened the folder and turned the first page toward me. Edward's company lost its investors about 3 months before the wedding. I looked at her carefully. 3 months, she nodded. Yes, the funding negotiations collapsed. After that, the company was running almost entirely on borrowed money. That alone explained more than I wanted it to. Marcella continued. His credit rating dropped soon after, low enough that he wouldn't qualify for a loan on his own. I leaned back slightly in the chair. For a moment, I didn't say anything. So the loan wasn't about expanding the company. I finally replied. Marcella shook her head. No, it was about keeping the company alive. She slid another document across the desk. These are the transfers that happened right after the loan was deposited. I read through the list slowly. Several payments covered existing debts. Others were large transfers leaving the country entirely. Marcella folded her hands. The wedding created a useful timeline, she explained quietly. A large public event that made the loan seem natural. I understood then why Edward had been so confident during our conversations. He hadn't needed my approval in the way I had assumed. What he needed was my credit history attached to the loan. For a moment, I felt anger rising. But something else followed it. Clarity. Andrea might not have understood every detail of Edward's finances, but she had made one choice very clearly. She chose to trust him instead of listening to the hesitation I had tried to express. That decision had consequences. And this time, those consequences were starting to become visible. The morning after my meeting with Marcella, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I had already decided what needed to happen next. The only thing left was writing it. The email itself was short. Subject line: borrower absence and missed payment notice. In the message, I explained that the two borrowers connected to the $300,000 loan were currently outside the United States and had already failed to make their first scheduled payment. I included the dates and the basic information the bank would need to review the situation. There were no accusations in the message, just facts. Before sending it, I called Marcella to let her know, "This will trigger the clause we added." She told me, "I understand. Once the bank reviews it, they'll begin the default enforcement process. That's the point." I replied. Marcella paused briefly on the phone. "Things may escalate quickly after that. I expect they will." After we ended the call, I read the email one more time. It took less than a minute to press send. The response from the bank arrived within a few days. They acknowledged the notice and confirmed they were reviewing the situation under the default provisions in the agreement. Marcella called again later that week with an update. "Edward's company accounts have already been flagged," she explained. "Some of them are frozen while the bank reviews the transfers." I listened quietly. "Potential investors are backing away," she added. "No one wants to enter a company under investigation." For the first time since the wedding, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. I hadn't attacked Andrea or Edward. I had simply stopped stepping in front of the consequences they created themselves. The next several weeks unfolded in a way that felt slow at first, and then suddenly very fast. Marcella kept me informed as new details surfaced. Edward's company began receiving formal notices from creditors. Several of the debts that had been quietly waiting now demanded immediate repayment. Without new investment money, the business had no way to continue operating. A few days later, Marcella called again. "Edward's company filed dissolution paperwork this morning," she explained. "Creditors forced the issue." I took a moment before responding. "So the company's finished?" "Yes, at least in its current form." After months of dodging my messages and posting beach photos, Andrea finally called. But she didn't call to say hello. She called because the money had run out. "Mom, something strange is happening with Edward's business accounts. The bank froze them." I listened without interrupting. She continued quickly. "Edward thinks it's just a misunderstanding. Can you call the bank and explain the situation?" I kept my voice calm. "What situation? The loan, Mom? They're acting like we did something wrong." The confidence in her voice was familiar. Andrea had always believed that if something went wrong, I would find a way to fix it. "Mom, you've dealt with banks before," she continued. "You can clear this up." I let a few seconds pass before answering. "No, this time you fix it." The silence on the other end of the call lasted longer than anything she had said. Then her voice changed. "What do you mean you and Edward signed the agreement?" I told her quietly, "You borrowed the money." Her tone sharpened. "Edward expected investors to finalize everything. It was supposed to be temporary. That may be what he hoped." I replied, "But the contract didn't depend on hope." A few days later, she called again. This time, the confidence was gone. "Mom, the bank is asking questions about the transfers." she explained quickly. They think Edward moved money overseas. I didn't argue with her version of events. I simply stayed with the facts. You took the loan. You left the country when the first payment was due. Those choices belong to you. Andrea began crying halfway through the conversation. I listened without interrupting. Years ago, I would have tried to calm her immediately. Now I understood that sometimes people need to sit with the consequences they created. The calls continued for several weeks, each one shorter than the last. Eventually, they stopped altogether. For the first time since the wedding, the silence between us felt complete. About 6 months later, Andrea returned to Savannah. I heard about it before she contacted me. Marcella called first. They came back. She explained. Edward's company is officially gone. Creditors forced liquidation. I thanked her for the update and ended the call. By then, none of it surprised me. Later that evening, Andrea finally called. Her voice sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard before. Mom, we had to sell everything, she began quietly. The condo, the car, Edward's equipment. I didn't interrupt. Then her tone hardened. You ruined us. I walked over to the bookshelf in my living room and took down the folder that had been sitting there for months. Inside were the loan documents. I opened the agreement and read the signatures slowly. Andrea's name, Edward's name, and finally mine. When I spoke again, my voice stayed steady. No, I told her calmly. You ruined yourselves. I just kept the receipts. Andrea didn't respond right away. The line stayed quiet for several seconds before she finally ended the call. Later that night, I sat outside on my porch with my phone beside me. After a while, the screen lit up again. A message from Andrea. Only 2 words. Mom, please. I looked at the message for a long moment before locking the phone and setting it down. Sometimes people believe love means protecting them from the results of their choices. I spent many years thinking the same thing. But life has a way of teaching something different. Accountability is not cruelty. Sometimes it's the only way people learn what their decisions actually cost. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how complicated family, trust, and responsibility can be. The night stayed quiet after that, and for once, I let it stay that way.